Happy Halloween, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Return of the Obra Dinn for PC and Mac. This is a mystery game, although if you had to describe it mechanically, it's closest to a puzzle game by Lucas Pope that was released earlier in October of this year, and it's a pretty wild departure from the previous game Lucas did, which is also what he's most well known for, which was Papers, Please. Regardless of how different it is from his previous work, however, Return of the Obra Dinn did get a very positive reception on its launch, and it's gone on to become one of the most positively received games of this entire year. So let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, the game immediately stands out from the pack just because of its visual style, which is designed to emulate the old school 1-bit Macintosh games, which if you haven't played any of those, I can't really blame you, it was a long time ago, but they were monochrome games with a visual style very similar to what you see in Return of the Obra Dinn, except Return of the Obra Dinn is actually a very modern game with full 3D rendering. It's just designed to look like that. And as a result, it's a very unique visual style that you really don't see anywhere else. This does present a couple of issues, however. One of them is actually rather simple. It's just that this visual style's really not for everyone. Some people are going to really get a kick out of it, especially people who are nostalgic for those old Macintosh games. But for more modern audiences, it's a bit of a hit or miss proposition. Some people will really dig it and think it's striking. Other people will look at it and go, "Ugh, that's monochrome, it looks terrible," and all that sort of thing. So that's just a matter of personal preference, really. But then there is an actual objective issue with the visuals, and that's that the lo-fi visual style, while certainly attained pretty much perfectly, is also problematic for determining certain finer details when you're actually looking around and trying to get the clues that you need to actually finish the game. This is something that'll make a lot more sense when I actually get to the gameplay, so just bear with me a moment and I'll explain it in due time. But for now, just understand that the visuals, while certainly very striking, being a very unique art style, and doing exactly what they're setting out to do with the surprising amount of fidelity, unfortunately have a bit of a side effect that does affect the gameplay negatively. Meanwhile, you go over to sound design, and there's not really anything to complain about there except for the fact that some of the music seems a bit odd compared to the scenes that you're seeing it in. I mean, to give you a prime example, one of the earliest scenes in the game is a fairly brutal melee, and it's got some fairly upbeat music playing while you're investigating the scene. It just seems a bit odd, even though the music itself is rather catchy. And the rest of the soundtrack is certainly solid. It's not bad music by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that sometimes it seems a bit odd compared to the scenes you're seeing it in. But apart from that pretty much negligible issue with the music, the rest of the sound design is rather solid. It's got rather strong sound effects, particularly with the atmospheric sounds, that really do help you get into the game and get immersed. And then you've got voice acting, which is designed to emulate the accents of the period, and it generally works out pretty well, though sometimes it does come across as a bit cheesy. But luckily in this particular instance, it's the endearing kind of cheesy. So overall, the game is very well presented, but what about the story and the gameplay? Because those are the real meat of this thing. Well, the basic idea of the story is that there was a merchant vessel called the Obra Dinn, which set forth from London but never made its rendezvous and was declared lost at sea. But 5 years later, it drifts back into port, and you play as an insurance investigator who boards the vessel and tries to determine what exactly happened there and assess the damages. To that end, you have 3 tools available to you. The first of them is a book cataloging all of the tragic events aboard the Obra Dinn. The second is a magical pocket watch that allows you to look into the past and see how an individual met their demise. And the third and most important tool is you yourself as a player, because it's all of your observations and your deductions that will allow you to finish the game. I mean, the objective seems straightforward enough. All you need to do is go on board the vessel and determine the fates of all 60 members of the crew, but it very quickly becomes much more complicated than that when you realize that not all of it is going to be very obvious, and it's going to be difficult to determine certain members of the crew's identity simply because you have to pay a lot of attention to the environments and use a lot of deductive reasoning to figure out exactly who a person is and how they ended up meeting their fate. The game does give you everything you need to determine all of this information, but it's going to be up to you to piece everything together, and that's where all of the really interesting stuff lies. Because mechanically, the game is very simple and straightforward. You walk around around, you flip open the pocket watch, you examine a death scene, you take in all of the information available to you in that scene, and then either you can make a determination right then and there, or you can at least put in pieces of the information to maybe expand upon later. So for example, if you know how a person ended up meeting their fate, but you don't know who that person is, you can just pencil in how they met their fate on that particular scene, and then you can later on, once you figure out their identity, put in their identity, and it will eventually determine whether or not that is correct. It is worth noting that the fates are deemed correct in batches of 3, so you may not necessarily know immediately whether or not your guesses are correct. And while a handful of the identities can be determined within the scope of a single memory, you find that more often than not it takes multiple memories, or sometimes you even need more than simply memories, to determine who a particular individual is. And of course, you being an insurance investigator, you have to be extremely meticulous with the way you document everything. So for example, it's not simply enough to say that one particular character died. You have to say how they died, and who killed them if somebody killed them. So for example, if a particular character was murdered, you can't simply say that the character was murdered. You have to say how they were murdered. So let's just say that particular character was shot. You would have to say that they were shot. But it's not simply enough to say that they were shot. You have to say that they were shot by, let's just say, a gun. So they were shot by a gun. But then you have to determine by whom they were shot, and from there you're going to end up delving into memory after memory and going from one daisy-chained memory to another, because some of the memories do daisy-chain together, where you'll find a corpse in that particular memory, and then you can follow that one to some other point on the ship, and that will engage another memory, and that will get very involved over time. And as you continue going through these memories, you find that you learn more and more about what happened on the Obra Dinn, although even as the game gives you more information to work with, you still have to piece together a lot of what happened on your own, just based on context clues in the memories, as well as environmental storytelling, and even some bits of dialogue here and there. This helps to keep things interesting throughout the entire game, because piecing together what happens to an individual is certainly interesting enough, but solving these individual mysteries also helps you to understand the meta-mystery, what ultimately happened on the Obra Dinn, and why everything happened the way it did. There are a couple of problems with the way all of this is done, however. The first of them is that a lot of the deductions are going to require very minute details that, as I mentioned before when I was talking about the presentation, are sometimes not all that clear. Now, some of that is, of course, just the details being minute, but some of it is also the art style getting in the way of being able to tell what that detail is. Most of the time, it's pretty manageable, but sometimes the details are so minute that you really have to struggle to notice them. So that's something to keep in mind there. The other major issue is that this style of game is really not going to be for everyone. It's the kind of thing that's geared more towards a very meticulous, very patient sort of player who is going to go out of their way to try to find every last bit of information they can in order to come to the conclusions they need to come to. And if you're not that sort of player, then Return of the Obra Dinn's mileage is definitely going to vary for you. But if you go into the game with an understanding of what it's ultimately going to demand from you as a player and are willing to meet it on those terms, you'll find a very well-crafted mystery with a novel way of solving it and much more detail than you would normally expect out of a mystery adventure game these days. And ultimately I give it a 4 out of 5 with that stipulation. If you're really not very patient at all, then this is definitely not going to win you over. But if you are patient with it and you're willing to address the game on its own terms, you'll find one very well-made mystery game here. Thanks for watching.